Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome back to Manhood 401 here at Manhood University. So as you've probably noticed, we've been in a bit of an action theme here in 401, and this week's lesson is no exception. I want to talk to you today about our duty to confront issues head on. To illustrate this lesson, I want to talk about one of my favorite characters of the Old Testament, and that's David. Now, I get a little excited over him, so please bear with me, okay? In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we find him about to face off with Goliath. But it's all the things that happened before this epic battle that really help you to see how David's actions draw a map for how we should handle conflict. So the stage is set by Goliath's taunts shouted to the army of Israel, starting in verse 8. Now, for 40 days, he would call out to the Israelites and he'd say, "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." And then he adds this extra incentive. "This day I defy the armies of Israel." Now that piece is really important because the name Israel translates roughly to triumphant with God or who prevails with God. So the army he's defying has victory built in its name. And Goliath's threats are actually aimed at making them look foolish. And after all that, verse 11 tells us that on hearing his words, Saul, that's the king, and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, for those who've never picked up a Bible in their lives, let me explain why the Israelites are scared. You see, Goliath is an actual giant. Starting in verse 4, we learned that he stood about 9 feet 9 inches tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He wore a coat of scale armor of bronze that weighed about 125 pounds. The Bible says he wore bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod and its iron point weighed about 15 pounds. So besides being huge, Goliath was able to move with 125 extra pounds of armor on, just to give you an idea of how strong he was. So let's stop right there and pair up the story with modern conventional wisdom about conflict management. It's typically laid out in 5 ways based on the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument tool. And we start with avoidance. We move to accommodating. We have forcing, which is also called competing, which is just accommodating with the shoe on the other foot. Then there's compromise, and everyone's favorite, collaborating. The assumption with this model is always that your conflict involves someone with whom finding common ground is desirable. The thing is, the conflicts that men have to resolve these days, I said have to, not want to, are increasingly issues where a line is drawn in the sand. The person, group, or ideology that you're at odds with does not wish to have a happy ending. In these cases, you'll find a 6th method that is rarely discussed in management, but clearly a favorite of leaders, and that's confrontation. Follow me now back over those techniques, and let's look at David's leadership in this situation in contrast to King Saul's management. Let's start with avoidance. Now, for confrontation to make sense, let's take a cliche and modify it a little bit. You see, instead of the Philistines being the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Goliath is the 9-foot giant in the room. We often try to avoid problems, but there they are. Every day we wake up and they have to be dealt with eventually. A manager has a higher threshold for avoidance than a leader. A leader thinks strategically, so while he may employ avoidance as a tactic, he's calculating the moment for confrontation. Now on to accommodation, letting the other side have what they want just to keep the peace. To be fair, we can try accommodation. I mean, isn't that the new theme of our society now? We trip over ourselves to avoid offending any and everyone, right up to the point where the only wounded party is us. That hardly seems like a characteristic, though, that I want to see in a leader. Remember, there's a 9-foot giant in the room hurling threats and insults. Come on, leader, you have to lead. Then we move on to competing or forcing, and that's when it's our way or the highway. In Saul's case, though, he had no leverage to force his position on the 9-foot giant in the room, so moot point. For us, we end up with a problem that while we may have something that we can leverage to get our way, the person who had to accommodate us is still around and they will be back. Then there's the refuge of the spineless, compromise. Give a little, get a little. Okay, please don't hear what I'm not saying. Remember, we're not talking about those daily conflicts on the job where we have to employ tactics like agree to disagree or everyone back to your corners. When petty issues arise, lesser methods can certainly get it done. I'm all about the compromise for getting our team focused on what's important or breaking a stalemate between two equally important groups. But when you have to give a little, to be honest, aren't you hoping to get that little back the next time you go to the negotiating table? And so is your opponent. So, what would compromise have looked like in this situation? A treaty, perhaps? Okay, so let me ask you this. What's a treaty with a nation who wants to destroy you? They'll be back. Then there's the big one, collaboration. Now, I don't want to mislead anyone. I love collaborating. As a leader, if I can get someone on the same page as me and we can press together in unity, I consider that a big win. But collaboration was clearly not an option for the army of Israel. As Goliath made it abundantly clear, it was all or nothing. So manager Saul is out of options. When you face the kinds of conflict that are created by an all or nothing position, you need a leader. Enter David. A leader is well aware of the other methods to resolve conflict, but a leader is able to recognize which method to apply. A leader knows when confrontation is necessary. We're talking about principled stances, and for those there can be no compromise. When the thing causing conflict cannot be tolerated, and understand this, you have to know when things can't be tolerated. When you reach that point, you confront. That's what David did. He heard the threats and insults that Goliath had been hurling for 40 days, but it didn't take him 40 days of avoidance or contemplating accommodation or compromise to figure out what happened. He didn't want to manipulate Goliath or find out how they could work together. Goliath stood against everything he stood for. So wait, what's your Goliath? What's your 9-foot giant in the room that you're afraid to address because you want everyone to get along, everyone to have a say? You want everyone to like you. You want things to be fair. But we're talking about issues like bigotry, sexual harassment, the gross incompetence of a coworker, bullying, fraud. We're talking about that house that's been dealing drugs for the last 18 months, the alcoholic in your family that you make excuses for, the music your children are listening to, the teacher that seems a little too friendly with students, your neighbor who cares more about her new boyfriend than her kid that always has bruises and is always hungry. We're talking about people who infiltrate our space like a cancer with open mouths and closed minds, and they spew the kind of garbage that you know is unacceptable. We're talking about that insecure small man masquerading as an alpha male with the loudest mouth in the room and the smallest. Anyway, men, it's our job to say, stop that. That's wrong, or not on my watch. We don't say, hey, buddy, I don't know if you knew that the C word is offensive to women, or the crack house you're running is illegal, or that brothel isn't good for the neighborhood, but could you maybe tone it down a little? That's preposterous. And you know how I know? Because David showed us. Let's look at how he handled himself. He knows he can't let Goliath live, just like you can't let injustice, maltreatment, and lawlessness stand. And once he assesses the situation, you can tell he's already made up his mind to handle it because he asks, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? It didn't take him 40 days to come to that conclusion. He goes on to say, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Look at how he says it with authority, this uncircumcised Philistine. Now, don't worry, we're not going to take you on a trip to the operating room. Circumcision, though, in that time was a sign of a covenant with God. David knew his worth. It was a worth that Goliath didn't have. Now, it's the same worth that every other man on that battlefield had. They just weren't willing to tap into it. And that's what we face every day, men. A world full of leaders who don't know that they are called to lead. So they manage. Then David has to fight for the right to fight. Look at that. He tells King Saul, I'll handle the problem. Hey, you really want to make someone mad? Be willing to do what they weren't. Want to make them furious? Be willing to accomplish what they've told themselves is impossible. You got a whole bunch of men who are afraid of confrontation. So they try to pass their fears on to David. And even Saul says, you can't do it. Hey, fellas, remember that voice? You know, the one that says, you can't say that. Bill will cuss you out. What are you going to do? Take on the drug dealers? That's a losing battle. You can't pray there. You might offend someone. If she won't tell Steve to knock it off, you should stay out of it. You can't report him. He's the boss. You can't stop them. They're too powerful. You can't get city council to listen to you. These are all lies spoken by the worst kinds of liars, those who never even tried. So let's keep going. David says confidently now, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. He's not only ready to confront the problem, but he is certain of his victory, which changes his posture. And even when everyone accepts that he's going to confront the issue, those fraidy cats, they start offering him armor. Don't you just love how when you're the one to confront the problem, the people who've been there longer than you, which means they could have handled it any time they wanted to, right? But the people who've been there longer than you, those folks, they'll start to offer you useless, cowardly advice. When you go in there, try to reason with them, or don't expect much. There's my favorite. Maybe you should take someone with you. Really? Because none of you were useful before today. David rejects the armor. He grabs 5 smooth stones. Goliath starts moving in closer, like the drugs that used to be 2 blocks over and now they're next door. Now you're passing a prostitute on your way home. Now the kid next door and his mom have bruises. Enough is enough. Goliath hurls more insults and David says, now I told you he's my favorite. He says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know it is not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Gentlemen, I submit to you that kind of courage comes from knowing your worth, knowing that God put authority and responsibility in you. This is David saying, this will be the last day we put up with this. Today, the trap house closes. Today, I'm reporting your fraud to the authorities. Today will be the last day you beat up on your girlfriend and her son. Today will be the last day you tell me I can't pray. Today will be the last day you use a filthy adjective to describe another woman here. Then he runs toward him. Men, we run towards the trouble, not away from it. Don't get me wrong, this isn't fools rushing in. We get to watch David go from bystander to problem solver in a matter of minutes. Thoughtfully and sure of what God put in him, he runs toward the problem. And we get to the point of no return. And there's confrontation. He takes out a stone, he swings that slingshot around his head, and when he slings that stone, it hits the giant in his forehead. He took Goliath's own sword and cut off his head. Now, why did he cut off his head? For starters, it's because that's exactly what he said he would do. He'd made up his mind that the resolution would be final before he even engaged the giant. You see, in a confrontation, the problem gets dealt with once and for all. Men, we're not peacekeepers, we're peacemakers, and there is a difference. When presented with a conflict, a peacekeeper does everything to avoid confrontation. When a peacemaker is faced with conflict, he looks for the confrontation and gets to deal with the problem on his terms, not those of the aggressor. I mean, I don't know what your Goliath is, and chances are you have more than one, but you can't bargain with it. You cannot accommodate it. You cannot work with it. You can't coerce it. You have to confront it. Well, if that's not a call to examine the things you're putting up with in your life, I don't know what is. So your homework assignment is to find that thing that you've been putting up with for way too long. Pray about it and then believe that God will give you a way to confront it once and for all. If this was a shot in the arm to you, hey, I'm so glad for you, but don't be stingy. Be sure to share with somebody you feel could use it. Thanks for hanging out with me this morning. I will see you all back here next week. God bless you.